Welcome back. We are having our first conversation of the morning, and as we teased, it's all about the new design for the Belize dollars. We are joined by Dr. Osmond Martinez, and he is the CEO in the Ministry of Finance, Economic Development, and Investment. Good morning, Doctor.
Good morning. Good morning.
Now, this is a conversation I think that many Belizeans have been waiting for us to have. And that, of course, has to do with the new design of the Belize dollars. There are many questions and concerns that follow this topic. So before we even get to that, perhaps we can begin with where we are as it relates to the design of the Belize dollars.
Well, first of all, good morning.
Good morning.
And thank you for inviting me here. In terms of the design of the Belize dollar, I believe that the Central Bank of Belize would be a very good stakeholder to invite to the talk show, because they're the ones who have been working from the onset of this discussion with the design of the currency. In terms now of the value, whether there will be any devaluation, whether there will be any valuation by changing the design, I think that's more of a conversation that I will be able to sustain. But in terms of the design, it's more with the Central Bank of Belize.
Okay, so in short, you wouldn't know how the design process was carried out.
No.
You would only be able to speak on the value of this currency.
That's correct.
Well, let's start there then. Because that is a concern that many Belizeans have, or many persons in the public have. They believe that with removing the face, the Queen Elizabeth II, the value of our Belize dollar will change.
Right.
It will devalue. What do you say to that?
Well, the answer is no.
Okay.
There won't be any devaluation. And so, for example, let's look at history. Okay. So while we are a colony of the United Kingdom, there are many other countries who were colonies of France, Portugal, Spain. And they have moved on many years ago. And the reason why they have moved on many years ago is because when you look at their history, compared to Belize, to our history, is practically we gained our political independence in 1981, which is will be about 42 years now, 43 years. While, for example, let's use Central America. Central America gained their independence in 1821. So in 2021, it was 200 years already of independence. And they have changed their design of the currency and who is in their currency, whose face is in their currency. And that did not impact it, the value of their currency or their strength, whether there is valuation or devaluation. Now, one of the things that we need to understand is that the Belize currency, for example, is pegged to the US currency. And within that agreement, which is published within the Central Bank of Belize website, you can actually access the agreement. At no point it speaks that you must hold a certain design in order to hold the peg agreement of the 2-to-1 with the US currency. It actually speaks that Belize should be able to have 40% of the total circulating currency. Of the total circulating currency, 40% should be foreign assets. In this case, foreign exchange, what we will call here our reserves. So in the past, for example, again, when you look at history, the value of a currency was based on how much gold you had on your reserve and how much gold a country does have. The United States, in their U.S. Federal Reserve, they were the ones with the highest amount of gold, and then thereafter, after World War I and World War II, they became a huge suppliers of both goods, services, and even loans to the countries that were affected And then they continue to gain strength because they used to trade with gold. But at one point, they're like, okay, we no longer need the gold. No, it is by the supply and demand of different nations. Even though Belize's currency, we don't have a control of how strong or how weak our currency is because it's pegged to the US currency. So, for example, even though it's a 2-to-1, in reality, sometimes it's a little bit stronger, sometimes it's a little bit weaker. And I'll give you a typical example. Now, when the US currency gains strength in the market, in the global market, our currency also gains strength.
Okay.
And that's why when you go to Chetumal, sometimes you will get 8 pesos for a dollar, sometimes you will get 9 pesos for a dollar. And that is because it's linked to the US currency. And
Why is it linked to the US currency?
It's pegged. That's one of the. It's a very wise decision because an economy, a small economy like Belize, to peg the U.S. currency, our currency to the U.S. currency. The U.S. currency is one of the most stable currency in the world. So, for you to have that peg agreement, it's very good because that means that countries like Belize will be more economically stable. It will help us in terms of controlling our devaluation and the power of purchasing. And more important, countries like Belize that we are mostly importers because everything that we import, we are high consumers, but we import most of, if not everything that we consume. So when you look at statistics, we import 53% of what we consume. And that now, having a strong currency and stable currency, it helps when it imports. Now, other countries, they choose to look at their supply and demand. For example, let's look at Mexico. Mexico is an exporter. So it does not benefit them to have a strong currency. Why? Because they want to be able to compete. When you look at the purchasing power parity, they want to compete on a way on the global market where they want to export. So you will have countries like China, Mexico, India, whose currency is relatively weak, but it is weak by design because they want to import more. Export more. And so, and then countries that have a strong currency, you know, when you look at their trade imbalance or trade deficit, it's much bigger because we are consumers, we import more.
So how would that work for us that we are looking at ways of how we can export more?
Right.
How does that work for us then? Will we have to consider our currency being devalued to export properly?
The devaluation of a currency is not an easy task because people suffer. You know, especially when there is not a design that was designed properly. So in the case of Belize have to look at the niche markets, you know, whereby, for example, and look at the comparative advantage and how we can create that balance in terms of our trade deficits. So, for example, what are our comparative advantages? BPOs. We are the only English-speaking country in Central America. Geographically, and in that, when you look at our location, for example, geographical position, we are only 1 hour and 50 minutes away from Miami, about 2 hours from Houston, a little bit over 2 hours from Dallas, 3 hours from Atlanta. I mean, so the time difference help. Belize is well positioned for that. Now that have an inflow of foreign exchange because we have a tendency of measuring a trade imbalance only by the exchange of goods, by how many containers are shipped out and how many containers are shipped in. So you have a trade imbalance there. But what if we measure it from the dollar point of view? How much money comes in as US and how many went out? And that is what we are not doing. And Belize definitely is in a good position in that terms, because when we look at the dollar value now, we have tourism, who brings U.S. currency. We have the BPOs, whereby Belize is selling a service. The only thing is that we cannot put the services on a container, you know, but it's creating so many jobs. The other day I got some data from CEO Garcia, who's the CEO in the Ministry of Investment, and she was saying that in the last 2022, I believe it was 8,000 or 6,000 more jobs were open, are created under the BPOs, and about 13,000 more will be created at the end of 2023. You know, and so I know they are even exploring the opportunities to create jobs in, well, to establish BPOs in Dangriga, which is already operational, and now some studies are being done in Punta Gorda, in the Toledo district. So when we look at trade imbalance, we're measuring from the good standpoints of, but now we have to look at the dollars inflow and outflow. Okay? And so the other part is, for example, we may not have a comparative advantage to export to Mexico or to any other country whose currency is weak, but we can definitely export to the Caribbean, whereby the Caribbean is not does not, you won't be able to compete with Belize. One, because they don't have the land mass, and two, because the land would not lend itself to be of a productive, to produce what we produce, no? And so the niche markets are very important. So for example, now Belize have a new industry that is about to yield good results, and that is the coconut industry and the coconut oil, you know, and by exporting coconut oil, we will definitely see a very good opportunity in terms of closing that gap that we want to close in terms of our trade imbalance, you know, and our trade deficits.
And to my mind, I guess that brings the question of, given that the currency is pegged, how does the the fluctuations, I'll just use that word, in our local economy, does it affect the value of our dollar in that sort of a way, or is it that the pegging agreement means that the value really of the dollar is always constant, or is there an effect based on our economy?
Yeah, no, practically there is nothing that we can do to affect the value of our currency once we keep the peg. The peg agreement is there, no? And it's pegged to the U.S. currency. Therefore, one of the things that is very important to note is that it do change value, but that is because of the impact that it has within the U.S.
So once the value of the U.S. dollar changes, then ours changes.
Exactly. So let's assume that you are in a university, studying a university in the UK. Let's use another example, Germany, where you can pay with euros. And so let's assume that right now, as of today, the euro, you need $1.10 to buy 1 euro. But for some reason, in a month from now, or before I tell you that, so let's assume that your semester would cost 1,000 US, right? That means you need 1,100 US. No, pardon. Let's assume that your school semester will cost 1,000 euros per semester. So you need 1,100 euros, which means you need 2,200 Belize dollars per semester. But in a month time from now, the U.S. currency gains strength because the stock market, the European stock market, suffer some sort of decrease due to their supply and demand, and then it becomes 1-to-1. Okay, so you need 1,000 US to pay your semester, and not 1,100, and then you will only need 2,200 2,000 Belize to pay rather than 2,200. Okay, so nothing happened to the Belize currency in reality, but because it is pegged, we get to enjoy that benefit whereby you will pay less because the U.S. currency gains strength. Now imagine a business owner have a loan with a European investor, and let's assume it's $1 million euros, and for some reason, as of today, there is a decrease in the value of the European currency when compared to the American currency. And let's say it's at 10%. That means that if the Belizean investor has the money, he can pay off that debt today by a difference of 10% if the agreement was done in euros. No, hence, and this is very important, hence most agreements are done in US currency. Okay, because the US currency is one of the most stable one. Okay, and so most agreements, if not all, but most agreements are done using the US currency.
Oh.
And I think if, following international news, I think we see a bit of, let's say globally, there's some changes which are being proposed. I think one of the biggest ones is the one that they're calling the BRIC system, which involves countries like Brazil, Russia, China. Will global events like that, which would possibly have an impact on the value of the US dollars, we also feel the effects of that here as well, based on that?
The Brexit is not new. The Soviet Union did it in the past. They had their own system, their own economic system. And many times, the reason why they do it is because these countries have their own internal issue to compete. Okay, and sometimes they might have issues in having enough U.S. currency. I believe that, and this is my humble opinion, not the government's of Belize's opinion, I believe that the Brexit will only make, the U.S. currency stronger. And it happens when the UK removed itself from the European Union. I mean, they were the ones who suffer a little bit. I mean, the United States is well positioned. I mean, don't underestimate the U.S. economy. We think is fragile and is volatile. It is not. Yes, they do have their issues. They have a lot of problems like any other nation. But how can Brazil, for example, decide that they will trade 100% without using the U.S. currency? So what are they telling their investors? They're telling their investors, listen, we have a dictatorship system, and you can only trade with A, B, and C, which will not happen. So the investors have the free will to say, listen, I'm getting better prices at A or B. I need U.S. currency as well because the parts that I will need or some supplier that I need to supply what I'm going to build will not come from only these countries. No, the Soviet Union had a unique system. It was a very good system. They actually came to a point where they were able to sustain their own self and trade among themselves. But then what happens? You reach a peak where there is no more growth because your economy now becomes limited to only, I think they had 7 countries rather than taking advantage of the whole world. And so that is the situation. When you have restrictions, then it limits yourself. And I mean, and don't get me wrong, but I mean, it will take not too much time to go back into having to trade with the U.S. currency.
So we were able to explain how Belize keeps the value of its currency through a peg system with the U.S., which means that changing the face of our dollar will not affect the value of our dollar. Perhaps then we can move into the decision to change the value of our dollar. When did that come, and why was this something that you guys decided on? Because while, you know, a lot of people do have their concerns about the value, which we have since answered, a lot of people are saying, why fix when it's broken? You know, why change the face?
In terms of, and again, in terms of, I mean, we have to be nationalistic, you know, and I think there has to be a national pride and a national identity, you know. And when you look, for example, putting our father of the nation, the Right Honorable George Price, Honorable Philip Golson, I mean, this is huge for Belize, and at the same time, I believe it gives an identity to, I mean, if you ask little kids, you know, today, how does the Right Honorable George Price and Honorable Philip Golson look like? They won't know, you know, and so I think it's a good opportunity, but at the same time, honestly, I think that you need to get the Central Bank of Belize, you know, to talk about this a little bit more. They know the origin of the discussions and everything. I'm here speaking right now in terms of that as a Belizean. I mean, I'm very happy to know that we will see the faces of our heroes, you know, be more nationalistic, you know, and then there is hope for even future generations in saying, you know, there is room for improvements and there is a reward of why we should do good in Belize, rather than still having external powers being the ones who are the heroes.
And would you be able to say or confirm whether we're going to be having the same denominations of currency, that in terms of the bills, that we're still going to have the same 2, 5, 10, or if there's going to be any change to that, or we're going back to the $1 bill that we used to have back in the day?
No, I don't have that detail. Yeah, I'm assuming it will stay as what we have now, but no, I don't have that.
And in terms of the actual dollars in circulation, will actually, I guess, a lot of people, I suppose, don't know about, I guess, that process in terms of like printing money. Will there be, is it going to be something that requires, I mean, well, new money is printed all the time, but in terms of the actual dollars in circulation, will there be any change to that? And yeah, well, I suppose that's the question. Is there going to be any change, or is based on the new system that's going to be, new bills that are going to be printed?
I didn't understand the question.
Oh, it was more that I suppose the question is based if there's going to be any, or will we feel any change, I suppose, in the economy based on the new bills that will be printed, or if it's just going to be like a part of like the normal cycle, and will it be that the older bills will eventually be phased out?
I mean, we can see what is happening in the UK, no? That there is a transition from Queen Elizabeth to King Charles III, whereby there is a transition period, you know, slowly moving away, you know, into introducing a currency with King Charles III fears and phasing out Queen Elizabeth II currencies that were. So I'm assuming that by the time it gets back to the bank and then back to the central bank, once that currency or the currency with Queen Elizabeth fears comes in, then it will be kept here and it will not be supplied back to enter our ecosystem. No? So once it gets to a bank or to the central bank, I believe that will be it for. But
So they don't give it back out.
yeah.
So that's because
Yeah, I was gonna, no, I was gonna go a slightly different question, because one of the other things that when we talk about lateral printing money, um, a lot of people bring up a conversation about inflation. And so I was wondering about the link between currency, the production of currency, and inflation, especially in the context of our earlier conversation talking about the value of the dollar and it's being
Right.
pegged. So, yeah, so.
No, absolutely. If you print more money than what you should be printing, absolutely you will have an impact on inflation. But in this case, the central bank, who is the one who will do, who is responsible for the fiscal management of policies of our country, I am sure that the design that they have in place is one that it won't affect the increase of printing. At the contrary, I believe they are doing an excellent job in terms of the policies that they're trying to put in place to control inflation as much as they can, because inflation is, if you really look at our issue in Belize, I mean, we are limited in terms of how we control inflation and how the Central Bank of Belize control inflation, because most, well, we should say 100% of the inflation also comes from outside. Okay, why? Because if you look, for example, at the agro-productive sector, and they need to import fertilizers, insecticides, fungicide, and all the other chemicals that they will need to produce, then it is being imported in a way that they will have to work with the price in the international market. So if it's, imagine going into the small farmers. Think about those who are producing pineapples and papayas, fruits and vegetables. Then it becomes an issue, for them, and their operational costs practically increase, or it has a direct increase, and so they will have to pass it on to the consumer. Other than that, they will be out of business. So inflation is imported. It has not much to do with what we do in Belize. We can do a little bit, but it's very hard.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Osmond, thank you so much for clearing, I'd say, the misconception that many have as it relates to the value of Belize's currency. You definitely answered that question, as you mentioned, though, as it relates to the design and what we can look out for. That question would be posed to the Central Bank of Belize,
Right.
and all other questions involving when the process or when it's officially, I guess, released.
Right.
That would come from the Central Bank of Belize as well, I'm
Yes,
correct?
that is correct.
All right, well, do you have any last words as it relates to, just what you're doing in your ministry?
Oh, well, first of all, I believe that, and thank you, but first of all, when you look, for example, at our GDP growth, that's a lot of times there is not much publicity on what our GDP growth is. Actually, our GDP growth is being consumed right now by inflation and the ads about inflation. But Belize's GDP growth in the last 2 years has been very interested to look at what the country have done in such a short period of time. So when you look at first in 2021, our GDP growth was at 16.4% or 15.8%. Then in 2022 at 12.4%, and Q1 of 2023 is at 11.4%. And one of the things is that inflation has been a killer for Belize, but it's also one that is impacting, that it has a global impact. And Belize has one of the lowest inflation rate in the region. And in May of this year, for the first time since the pandemic, our inflation decreased to 3.6% or 3.8%. And so it was above 6, 7, and all the way to 9% in the previous statistics reports. So the fuel price as well, something that the media houses does not capture it when it goes down. They do capture it
Why
when
do you
it
think they don't?
If you put an ad right now and you come and we want to talk bad about a political party or a government, our views will increase. But if we just want to have a conversation that does not have a little spike,
Drama.
drama, I don't think it create much problems. And so the media houses, for example, I don't know why, but when the price of fuel goes up, every single one of them, is saying, oh, the price of fuel went up. But when the price of fuel has decreased, there is a complete silence.
That's really interesting because I love that you're mentioning the improvement in our GDP rate and inflation of Belize being one of the better performing countries in the region as it relates to the effects of inflation.
Right.
And I say that because while we're having these conversations, a lot of people, including our viewers, would say, well, we can't really feel the difference. We can't really feel that our economy is doing better, or we can't really feel that prices are dropping because
Right.
they don't drop. Instead, they would stay the same, right?
Right.
So people tend to feel more a price increase
Right.
because prices don't reduce. What would you say to that?
Well, in terms of inflation, you are right, and that's where I believe that. Well, let me correct myself. I will say you are partially right.
Okay, correct me then.
Because if the fuel price was at almost $14 and it decreased to a little bit over 11, that means the price went down.
For fuel.
Yes.
But if we're talking things like, which, again, the public speak of, general groceries.
Right.
Those don't drop.
No, and that's an issue that cabinet is working on.
Okay.
And I know that at the CEO caucus we get the debriefing from cabinet. Cabinets meet on Tuesday. CEOs meet. The CEO caucus is on Wednesday, and that is a constant topic that the price control board have to definitely get handle of it.
Okay.
So, but the impact of the economy, you may not be enjoying it how you should be enjoyed on normal times, but there is benefits. And I will show you some few examples, okay? So for example, when Guatemala played Belize football in Belmopan a couple months ago, by 5 p.m. on that day, before the game was at 7:30 p.m. and at 5 p.m. there was a sign and the gate that says, no more tickets available. That's a sign that there is a consumption power. If anyone can tell me when that happened before, if any scenario like that we have seen before, it will be good. I would want to see it. The second one is, when you look, for example, at last week, there was a volleyball competition here where I want to congratulate our female volleyball team. They did a spectacular job, and in our hearts, they are our champs.
Yeah.
But when you look at it, the amount of people that kept coming every day, and Friday, the Civic Center was packed. Where is the money coming from?
So you're saying that we're not as broke as we say we are, or we're not suffering as much as we say we are?
I am saying that, and I will be very careful with my words. Yes, the cost of living is high, and so people do feel it. But then there is also more money circulating in our economy that actually mitigates some of these problems. And so, for example, when you look at the minimum wage, that had an increase of almost 60%, that mitigates some of the costs of the problems of cost of living, because our citizens now had a little bit more of money in their pockets. So, and Just to make something very clear here, you know, a lot of people forget that before 2020, it's not like things were bright. We were still living paycheck to paycheck, you know. No, because of the fragility that existed in our economy, COVID-19 actually exposed the fragile economy that we had, okay? And so, no, and I share it in another media house, that if you look at this administration has been in for 2 years and a half. But in reality, it has been in for 1 year and a half. And I will tell you why. Because the first year as you walk in, what was the main priority?
COVID-19.
Save lives. Save lives.
Yeah.
You know,
So you were able to really prioritize the things that you set out to do.
Exactly, it was save life. What was the second priority, or maybe a priority in parallel? Save the economy.
Bounce back.
Well, it was not even about bounce back. It was about save it from collapsing. You know, and the only period of time in this last 2 years and a half that our currency was actually in a situation where it could have been devaluated was if our currency would have collapsed.
Okay.
We would have been devaluated. I mean, we'd have been much worse right now. And when we look, for example, so first you have to save life, and then you have to save the economy. Okay. And like I said, for example, in another media house last year around this time, I was like, okay, we are out of the intensive care unit, but our economy was still under observation. Now, at the end of last year is when you start to see that our economy was fully recovered to the 2019 levels. Now, that's a point to celebrate. But let me ask you a question. Were we well off in 2019? And I won't put you in a hard position. I will answer for you, no, we were not. So, which means that we were suffering. And to be back at 2019, it does not mean that we are well off. No, no, we are starting to transform the economy. Okay, and as of this year, you started to see unemployment rate is low at 2.8%. Now, some would want to question it, whether the data is right or wrong. And I won't argue the formula, I won't argue that point. I will just recommend go and ask the business people and the business community how difficult it is for you right now to get someone to work at your place.
Yeah. We are just out of time, Dr. Osmond. I wish we had more time. I know that this is a conversation that there are so many angles that we can touch on. But I want to say thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, as I mentioned before, for explaining particularly the concerns that a lot of Belizeans have as it relates to the value of our currency and changing the design. And we look forward to having you here with us in the future as well.
My pleasure.
All right.
Always open to be at Open Your Eyes.
Yes. All right, we're going to take a break, and when we come back, we will be joined by our friends Digi to talk about the latest promos and deals. Don't go away.